Welcome to the Dish on Divorce. I'm Leanne Townsend.
And I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And on today's show, we have as a guest Jennifer Lawrence. And Jennifer is a divorce coach, but she has a particular expertise in financial abuse, although she does coach clients with other things as well. And this is such an important topic. And so I'm really excited that we're addressing it today. So thank you for coming on the show, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're excited to deal with this because this is a problem that I don't think gets talked about as much as, we hear about physical abuse and more we're hearing about emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse, but we still don't hear as much about financial abuse. And so how much of a problem is this?
It's actually a big problem. So they've estimated that 95% of all intimate partner abuse cases do involve a component of financial abuse. And financial abuse, it's most commonly thought of as, denying a spouse access to a bank account or a paycheck, but it can also extend to broader economic abuse, which is, preventing them from working or getting education. We've heard of cases over COVID where people are hiding their spouse's laptop so that they can't log into work. So it really is a major issue. It's quite hidden because there aren't bruises. A lot of people don't know it's economic abuse. They just know that it's yet another barrier to leaving when there are other kinds of abuse going on. Because if you can't, get the money together to hire a lawyer or to find safe shelter, it's very hard to leave a situation where there may be physical or other forms of abuse. So that's why we're looking at shedding a light on it and helping people get out of a situation where it's happening.
Very interesting. I do a lot of screening for domestic violence. And what I see when I ask these questions, and a lot of the financial abuse questions are within the screenings, people don't even realize that they've incurred any kind of abuse. The second thing that I see when I see the financial abuse with clients when I'm screening them is it's rarely alone. So I'm seeing other parts of domestic violence, not allowing you to talk to your family, your friends, but it's not just the physical, as you said, like it can be coercive control as well, which is what a lot of financial abuse falls under. But like a learning disability, you usually don't have one thing going on.
Absolutely. And that's what we find. And that's why we were, I am on a task force with the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment, which is a Canadian organization working with government and with financial institutions to make some changes in this area. And we were happy to see in the new version of the Divorce Act that financial abuse is seen as family violence and is, named and recognized, because often it is an element of coercive control. And it does, as you mentioned, go along with a lot of these other types of abuse. It also tends to be, a first red flag in abuse that escalates, because for controlling people, they will first try to control, using emotional abuse, tying down finances, and abuse tends to escalate over time. So it is important that people recognize it before it builds to the point where it's very hard to exit.
The things you and I have chatted about is how, often you might have a client or I might have a client who is, in a situation where they're driving around in a Range Rover, wearing designer clothes, designer purses, but they have access, this woman has access to no money because she's been cut off, post-separation, and her husband is, not giving her spousal support or not paying what he should pay. And it's, women in that situation are often quite isolated because a lot of people don't, they see them pull up in the Range Rover in their designer outfit, and people don't have sympathy, as naturally, because they think, oh God, look at her, how can she be complaining about not having money? But it's a very real problem for some people, who've had a certain lifestyle. and it's cut off, and it's deceiving just because they have these few things that they manage to keep from, temporarily at least, from the marriage.
Absolutely. And I find I live in a wealthy suburb of Toronto, and it amazes me because there are a lot of women who do not work outside the home, and their husbands have, pretty big and powerful jobs. And so, as you say, they have access to the leased Range Rover, often not in their name. They often have a supplementary credit card, but supplementary credit cards aren't in your name, and they don't build your credit rating, and they can easily be cut off. And so, a number of women who talk about getting allowances, not having any sense of what the overall family income really is, not having a voice in how things are invested. So yes, there's money for tennis clubs and Range Rovers and even for shopping and lunches. So there is a perception that these women are wealthy and have access to capital, but it is trapped capital, because at the end of the day, it's not in your name. And if you don't have your own credit card and are not building a credit rating, it's hard to get an apartment if you decide to leave. It's hard to get access to any form of, loans. So that's why, again, shedding some light on this issue, it really does cut across all socioeconomic levels, and finding out areas with some help. And as you say, for people with, assets, it's sometimes hard to access things like legal aid. Now with COVID, a lot of those thresholds have been dropped or lowered in the case of family violence, and family abuse is now considered or financial abuse is now considered family violence. So, it is one way of accessing the legal system, if for nothing else, to get, exclusive possession of the matrimonial home, or to get access to, funds that are invested that are, in divorce. It is worked out with a family lawyer because they are considered matrimonial assets. But if you can't get a lawyer to help you, it's very difficult. So you sort of need the money to free up more money. And that's where a lot of people run into a roadblock.
And then there's that other problem that even if there are assets, which we know eventually are to be divided, right? That wait time, and what do you do in between? And COVID slowed everything down, and then you're not in an emergency because you have a roof over your head, you're not being evicted, right? So the delay. And then if you don't have access to money, even if you can afford to get a lawyer who says, okay, you have a good case here, so you can pay me later, don't worry about it. Well, that other side has a lot of power because they can hire the most expensive, aggressive lawyer that's just going to play that game of let's let you bleed out.
Absolutely. Sure. And you see legal abuse and financial abuse can be closely tied because they're, frivolous lawsuits brought up in the context of divorce, or, suddenly a lot of custody issues are raised. And really it is trying to bleed the other party dry. And so it is something that, I'm glad that it is being recognized in the new Divorce Act. I'm certainly hearing a lot more about financial abuse. I think financial institutions are becoming aware of it. But there's still a long way to go.
For sure. Now, when someone comes to see you as a client or as, a new client, what are some tips that you give them to begin the process of perhaps protecting themselves financially? Maybe do you have clients come and see you before they leave, first off?
Very much so. I would say probably
what advice would you give them?
Yeah, like maybe 30% of clients are pre-leaving. And so, there's a couple routes. One is strategically staying for a time while you build capital. And that's how can you stay safely? And that's, maybe you're selling handbags, talking to friends and family, finding some ways to, having a side hustle, finding some ways to accumulate some capital so that when you do decide to exit, you have some financial runway. In terms of exit plans, it's, doing research. Because there is information out there. I've started a free online resource called lunchattheclub.com, which is, a sort of behind a wall access to information about how can you access capital? How can you talk to lawyers to find out about, having more back-end ended fees. There is litigation financing is an option in Canada. So there are some options out there, but it's research. And so if you can stay safely, safely with, for your children and for yourself, sometimes having the time to sock some money away, to get a small credit card in your own name if you can, so that you can start to build a credit rating. Because again, if you're leaving and you're renting, it helps if you have a credit history. So it is one of those situations where preparation is key. And, talk to people. Women's shelters are a great use of they have great resources. And, talk to some safe friends and family. I mean, one of the things I find is problematic is that often when the husband is powerful, women will be in a community where the community will turn on her because he's got the money, he's got the concert tickets, he's got the plane, he's got the access to all the fun stuff. But it's finding, family, people who could give you a loan potentially, so that you have some options.
I think that another issue is that the general public doesn't understand financial abuse. So even if you go to speak to a friend or a family member, they're like, stop having a pity party. He doesn't hit you. You live in a beautiful home. Everybody has problems, and it's minimized, right?
Absolutely.
It's almost like you have to come out with 2 black eyes and no teeth where, hey, I'm abused.
Yeah.
And the abuse can start very slowly. You've mentioned the allowance, but then there's that watching over. So going through the credit card statement, what did you spend $322 on at Longo's? That having to be accountable for every single little thing, right?
Yeah.
You have a power imbalance like this, and that person, usually the woman, is treated like a small child.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is coercive control. And in the case of some wealthy families, they don't need to go beyond financial abuse to have total control of their partner because the money is powerful enough. I mean, these are the people who will go to a bunch of lawyers to try to conflict them out of a situation. These are people who, have powerful people on speed dial, and people are afraid to cross them. So, it very much is something that we need to build an understanding of. And even for professionals, whether it's mental health professionals, family law professionals, mediators, there is a screening tool that's been built by Suggest, which is a nonprofit agency in Calgary that mediators can use to decide, is there a power imbalance? Because if you just ask a party, are you being abused? A lot of people will say no, because they think of that as that, physical abuse. Whereas if you say, do you have access to all of your bank accounts? Do you have credit in your own name? Has a loan ever been taken out in your name that you didn't want? If you start asking very specific questions, it will highlight a power imbalance that can be very helpful in helping these people. And so it's just really about helping inform professionals as well to ask the right questions. It's that screening, like you mentioned before, being so important and so powerful.
Sorry, Leanne.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think that as well, though, as a society and also we as women, I think we also have to take some responsibility towards this thing of, I want to marry a rich, powerful man, because I've come across some young women in their 20s who are, living with older men in their 40s who are very wealthy, very powerful, buying them all kinds of, these women are not working, they're being, these men are buying them all sorts of nice things, designer this, designer that, taking them on nice vacations, and putting them on an allowance and controlling them. And these young women seem to be okay with that because of the lifestyle that they're getting from it, and not fully understanding that this is a form of abuse. But they're also just willing to trade off their freedom, in a sense, to have this lifestyle. And on some level, our society kind of condones this sort of thing that, a woman, young woman, you should find a rich guy, rich, successful guy, you've married well, all of that. And I think we need to move away from looking at things that way.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Barbara Hewson, who writes under Barbara Stanny, she's written a book called Prince Charming Isn't Coming. And it's excellent. And I mean, it's a lesson I've had to learn in my own life to, figure out my own financial situation. And again, I mean, for me, I was an investment banker. I became a stay-at-home mom. I didn't have a financial abuse situation, thankfully. I did come across it in a dating situation with someone who was really trying to use some money to control me, which is what really shed light on this issue for me personally. But when I'm twice divorced now, when I came out of my second marriage, the number of women who said to me, "Well, I guess you'll have to get married again. Like, what are you going to do?" And I'm like, "I'm going to work," right? Like it just seemed like it wasn't something that was the automatic. It's like, oh, well, it's okay. You probably still have your looks. You can marry again. And I'm like, what? Like that.
That's
it's
another problem.
right. It's such an interesting place for one's mind to go. Whereas I'm like, no, I'm going to start a business. Like, so yeah, a lot of it is that reframing, it's the fairy tale that you're going to meet the prince and the castle. And I mean, as we all know from the Meghan Markle story, it is not a fairy tale, even when you do meet the prince with the castle. So, it's about being informed and educated and, having money in your own name and having education and a career to fall back on. Even if you're out of the workforce for a time, know that there's something you can go to.
It's so important. And when I think of these young girls who are with much older men, like Leanne said, often that much older man is not with her for her brains, for her intelligence,
for her personality,
her warm heart.
Yeah.
He's there because he has a good-looking arm and a good-looking woman on his arm, and it makes him feel good. But everybody gets older, everybody physically ages, and you can do as much work to yourself, and you can say, well, this lady looks lovely for 50, but that's it, for 50. You can never be 20 again. So there's that risk of when you start to age a little bit, if that was your whole purpose in this man's life, he's going to trade you in for a younger one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why having, even if you're, busy with kids or, if there's a travel lifestyle, if you're younger and he travels a lot and you're kind of traveling with him, but have a side hustle, like, be always learning and keeping skills refreshed because you just never know. And I just know that I talk to women in my practice who feel very powerless, and they all say the same thing. I can't believe I got to this position, because most of them are educated and they worked in these jobs, but just over time came to rely on the fact someone else would take care of them. And it's just not something you can rely on necessarily. So, it's at the end of the day, you need to figure out a plan that you can make your own money if you need to.
No, and that's how I was always raised. Like I was raised that, being pretty wasn't enough. You had to get an education. You had to bring other skills to the table. And I'm biased, but I think my daughter is a beautiful young girl, and her looks could certainly get her some, to some places, but it doesn't, to me, that's just like, that doesn't even matter. That's just like a bonus if that helps open a door for you, but you get educated and you have skills and you have a nice personality and a kind heart. And I feel like that message still needs to be drilled into, young women. And it's great to stay at home and raise, children. I think it's very hard with single parent families or families where both parents are working jobs and everyone's trying to juggle everything. I mean, it is lovely to be in a position to have someone at home running the household and taking care of the children. But if you choose to do that, you have to recognize you are putting yourself in potentially a vulnerable position down the road if you don't keep your skills up and you don't keep your network up and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And, that's where, whether it's, having conversations to make sure you have access to finances. And if you don't, looking at even postnuptial agreements, like some way where you're defining, like, yes, the marriage is working, but I feel vulnerable here because I don't really know what you earn and I don't really know where the money goes. And, there are also people who aren't aware that a spouse has like a gambling problem or has racked up debts in their name. And then when divorce does hit, all of a sudden they think, well, I'm wealthy. I live in a big house. I drive a fancy car. But, they meet with their lawyer and they find out, oh my gosh, like we're wealthy, in terms of optics, we lease a lot of stuff, but there's not money there. And there's this huge moment of reckoning. So it's important that, if you are at home, that not only are you keeping skills upgraded and figuring out another path, because kids grow up and you're going to get bored, but beyond that, that you have some options and that you know where that money is going. Like you shouldn't just assume you're being taken care of, assume you're wealthy, and assume that, if you're living on an allowance and don't really have a sense of your financial background, like now is the time to have a meeting with your financial planner and figure out exactly where the money is, where it's going, what retirement funds are, whose name's on what, and know that you're being actually taken care of. Like that doesn't mean you get a credit card at a fancy department store. That means you're being taken care of,
I think
the
it's
money's
especially
there.
important too that if there's a family business,
Yes.
that you should know the going ons of that family business, because time and time again, I'm a mediator, Leanne's a lawyer.
Yeah.
What we see when there's a family business is people have no idea what that business is worth, what it earns, and the person who runs that business and owns that business does some fancy accounting, some fancy expenditures, and says, hey, it's worth nothing. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I see that, they bankrupt it, they offshore money. I mean, I've sort of seen it all. One of the screening questions asked when figuring out if someone is being financially abused is, are you working in the family business for free? Because if you're doing a lot of work in the family business or you have a family business, like, are you actually seeing money from it? Are you drawing a salary from it? Is the business paying taxes properly? Because again, otherwise you get this perception that you're fine, and you're not. And it's terrible when, it's better to discover this stuff when you're 30 than when you're 60, because then you have the runway to retrain and, work and build up your own reserves. If you find out about it because he bankrupts the company, runs off with someone who's 20 and you're 60, and I have heard that case a few times, it's really heartbreaking. So it may not be a comfortable conversation to say, I know I've never really cared about our family money before, but I feel like I need to educate myself on this. So let's start that process. It's far more uncomfortable when you're having that conversation in the context of divorce.
For sure. And I mean, one of the things you touched on that I see quite often come up is taxes. Like I've found situations where, the spouse, often the woman, doesn't realize that the husband has not been filing tax returns for years and years, and especially when they're self-employed and whatnot, and potentially owes a lot of money to Revenue Canada. So all this money that she thinks they don't have because Revenue Canada is owed, and unfortunately, part of the, fortunately or unfortunately, the part of the whole divorce process is you have to get your taxes in order and do the financial disclosure. And a lot of times I find people are resistant to that because they haven't done their taxes in years, and that's going to be a problem.
And people are blindsided by the fact that once you're married, not common law, but once you're married, whatever debt is both of your debt, and it doesn't matter whose name it is.
Yeah, and CRA can come after you as the spouse in certain situations for your partner's, what's owed, and you may have had no idea about it at all, and that isn't a defense.
Yeah, no, and it is heartbreaking because at that point, I'm a coach, I'm not a magician. You know what I mean? Like at that point, it's like it's just a hard lesson, and it's a hard lesson to learn late. And that's why, I think in the schools, there should be a lot more financial literacy taught. I think that the whole idea of supplementary credit cards should be gone. Like everyone should have their own credit cards in their own name and be building their own credit history. There are a lot of things systemically we can do, but the reality is, as an individual, it's just, you don't want to put your head in the sand when it comes to money. And so many people do, because it's a different language and there's lots of acronyms, and people, I think the finance world deliberately complicates it. But now is the time, if you're watching this and you're thinking, you have this uncomfortable feeling this might be you, it's the time to start those conversations. And there's some excellent financial planners out there, people through your bank, some great online services that will explain all of this and demystify it. But you don't want to be surprised by it in divorce.
Absolutely not. I'd like our viewers to know, because not everybody knows this, that Legal Aid Ontario also has a different phone number if somebody has been a victim of domestic violence. So bringing light to the financial abuse and coercive control with family finances is abuse. They can call that number as well.
For sure. I'm curious if either of you have ever come across a situation where it was a man being financially abused. I have not. I've seen men be physically abused or emotionally abused and things like that, but I have not seen one where there was a man being financially abused. Have either of you seen that?
I have not in my practice.
No.
The numbers are 1 in 4 women, they believe, is a victim of intimate partner violence. It's 1 in 9 men. Men tend to earn more on average, like women are making like 82 cents on the dollar. So just in terms of numbers, men tend to hold more financial power and they are less prone to experience abuse, but it is still happening. The numbers indicate it is. And I think it's even more of a stigma with men. I don't think they talk about it.
For sure. You said I
see it occasionally. Rarely, but occasionally.
Yeah. Well, and it may change as women get more powerful and our incomes go up.
Well, that's it. I've seen women, because I do a lot of screening. I'm actually a qualified screener for domestic violence. And we use a lot of different tools. And some of the questions are, in your marriage, who made the decisions about the major purchases? What would happen when you would disagree? Like, they're really, these little questions to get to the point. And we use different scales to assess. There's some basic scales, but then there are very lengthy scales for testing. One is the MASIC tool for domestic violence. But women can still have that financial control, because you're seeing women as CEOs. And I see that happen, right? That reverse role model in the marriage, where he's been the house husband taking care of the kids because she has that powerful job.
Yeah, so I think we'll see more of it. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer. As always, you're a wealth of information, and I think this is such an important topic. So thanks for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on and shedding light on this important topic. You're doing an amazing service by having this program. So thank you both.
Where can listeners find you if they'd like to work with you?
So for my private coaching practice, it's designeddivorce.com. And if you think you are experiencing financial abuse and want some more information, it's lunchattheclub.com. And that's a free service.
That's great.
That's wonderful. So thanks again. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of The Dish on Divorce. I'm Leanne Townsend.
And I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And we'll see you next time.